Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Dira Imam. I am the Beverly Hills Bar Association president, and we welcome you today to our program, Autonomous Vehicles, Bridging Technology, Law, and Policy. I'd like to introduce our speakers, Mark Hogue and Poria Parknod. We welcome you here, and thank you so much for putting this together. I'm excited to see what you guys have to say today. And to be a part of this program, so appreciate you being here. Mark Hogue is California licensed attorney, 3 times founder, host of Autonomous Cars with Mark Hogue, the first result on Google for Autonomous Cars podcast, and founder and partner of Hogue & Co., a global strategy consulting startup for autonomous vehicles and mobility. After starting his undergraduate studies in astrophysics, Mark spent nearly 4 years on a pre-engineering track before graduating with a BA in economics from UCLA. A voluminous writer on automobiles generally, and occasional automotive open track enthusiast, Mark publishes frequent articles on LinkedIn, Medium, and Quora. A frequent guest speaker and moderator for numerous events, webinars, and podcasts around the world, Mark was invited by Damier-owned Here Technologies to moderate and interview 3 days of takes at CES 2019. Mark founded Hogue & Co. by leveraging his vast experience in Silicon Valley startup, venture, capital, and legal scene, and bringing together the most brilliant minds in the autonomous vehicle and mobility spaces from around the world, including PhDs, engineers, and startup founders. Mark calls the burgeoning era of autonomous vehicles the greatest step change in humanity since the Industrial Revolution. Thank you for being here, Mark. Poria is a litigator licensed to practice law in California, New York, and Arizona. His practice focuses on commercial litigation, injuries, and privacy law. Martindale-Hubbell has awarded him its highest attorney rating, AV Preeminent, and Thomson Reuters named him its Super Lawyers Rising Star list from 2016 to 2018. Sorry about that, Poria. In 2018, he was elected the Fellows of the American Bar Foundation. Arizona network affiliates Fox, ABC, and CBS have invited Poria to appear on air as a legal expert. He has been quoted in articles for the Arizona Republic in Business Magazine. Thank you guys for being here, and we will start our first part of the program with Mark.
All right, I was still muted. Thanks very much, Dira, for the intro. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Poria, Dira, Alex, all good?
Looks good to me.
Cool. So,
all good.
Awesome. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining us today. This should be pretty fun, kind of a walkthrough of all things AVs. We're going to give you a bit of background on AV technology generally and where we're at. Poria is going to dive into some great discussion on torts, privacy and security, and criminal law, and then we're going to wrap it up with a chat about sort of a proposal I've had for quite some time about the need for an FAVA, Federal Autonomous Vehicle Administration. So obviously autonomous vehicles are a thing that we've kind of talked about for quite some time. We have really kind of fantasized about this this science fiction reality for quite a long time. And indeed, I call AVs the greatest step change in humanity since the Industrial Revolution. And here's why it's such a big deal. So we've got 1.25 million deaths caused by automobiles around the world. This brings us to 20 to 50 million worldwide auto injuries. In the US alone, we suffer 40,000 deaths per year, or as I like to put a rather sinister spin on it, I've been advised it's not the most delicate way to put it, but this does seem to have an impact. If you do the math, this is effectively a 9/11 tragedy every single month. And I just think it's really important that numbers are a meaningless thing without context, and what more brutally painful context is there than that? So I think it's really important to keep that in perspective. shockingly, 94% of vehicle accidents are caused by human error. And so the point is, if this were any other pursuit in life, it would have been rendered illegal long ago. In fact, if you look at where road incidents fall on kind of a spectrum of deaths by cause, you'll see that road incidents are actually the first non-natural death highlighted to so-called non-natural deaths, road incidents, and of course suicide. So yeah, the numbers are pretty staggering, to say the least. So let's dive in and really talk about what it is to be an autonomous car. I don't quite have the time to go into too much technology, and in any event, I will touch on this towards the end again, but suffice to say, you've got sort of a spectrum of technologies. So very kindly provided by our good friends over at NHTSA, we've got this sort of 6 levels of autonomy as put forth by the SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers. So on one end, level 0, of course, you've got, well, no automation. The human is doing all the driving, of course. And on the opposite end, you've got level 5, which is the so-called fully, truly, not just self-driving, but indeed driverless car, meaning no steering wheel, no gas and brake pedal. In this case, the driver is decidedly not, rather you're only a passenger. So where we are today is anybody with basic cruise control, well, that's level 1. Anybody with, say, traffic assist cruise control, radar assist cruise control, and say lane keep assist or any sort of steering assist, that's level 2. For those of you with a Tesla, spoiler alert, you are not fully self-driving. Never mind what that checkbox says, although you will be one day. More on that later. But Teslas are effectively, let's just call them a really good level 2, and maybe, if you want to be generous, borderline level 3 in certain conditions-ish. Here's the thing. Level 3 is a tricky thing because, well, the driver is required to always be effectively on demand, to take over on a moment's notice. This is a really dangerous thing, a very scary thing. And it's a good aside to mention the so-called paradox of safety, which suggests that as a thing becomes safer, well, it actually becomes more dangerous because you're willing to take more risks. In the words of my first econ professor at UCLA, if you really wanted a safe car, what you would do is you'd build a car without a seatbelt, without airbags, and you put a giant metal spike in the steering wheel. People would drive a lot safer then. So to sort of avoid this paradox of safety, then a lot of car makers now are effectively skipping level 3 and they want to go straight to level 4. So level 4 autonomous cars are, as I like to put it, somewhat tongue-in-cheek. The car can drive itself in all conditions at all times, except when it can't. And in those situations, it needs to allow a nice big margin of error to hand over control to the driver. So it can't be like, say, level 3, which is all of a sudden on a moment's notice, or level 2, Tesla suddenly chimes at you, says, hey, take over. No, this has to actually give you a proper heads up that you're going to need to take control. In practical terms, the way level 4 has, well, decidedly not yet fully manifested, but a good example of where it's headed is those of you who are familiar, say, with GM's so-called Super Cruise technology, that's kind of an element that'll go into level 4 technology, where the vehicle is effectively preloaded with all of the mapping data for certain roads and highways. And in those limited scenarios, it does a pretty good job of driving itself, although even then, to be super clear, even that is not a level car per se. Rather, that's an example of a type of technology which one would expect in a level car, the ability to fully have mapped out data for wherever it's driving. And again, level 5, no steering wheel, no go or brake pedal. You are indeed, for all intents and purposes, a passenger. So a little bird from the Beverly Hills Bar Association said to me that there's a new show on Amazon Prime called Upload, which rather surprised me because I'd never heard of it. And yeah, it is remarkably on point. I watched the first 15, 20 minutes or so of it, which showcased a remarkably not ridiculous vision of an autonomous vehicle future. It was not awful until the guy crashed and died and went to some sort of virtual heaven, at which point I totally tuned out. But yeah, it's a really great...
Mark, not to interrupt, but
Yeah.
I was that little bird, and I actually watched that episode.
Yes, you were.
So being that little bird, I'm assuming that the level of autonomous vehicle this was the level 5 you're describing. Is that correct?
It's tempting to say so because there is indeed no steering wheel. However, he has pulled out what appears to be, if I'm not mistaken, Poria, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's a PS4 controller, which has been retrofitted to control the car. So strictly speaking, yeah, not a level 5 really, but he does have direct hands-on control. I mean, joking aside, yeah, this is somewhere kind of in between. I would still suggest it's probably a really fleshed out level 4. The idea with level 5 is that it really is, for all intents and purposes, not a car, but really, yeah, I guess you could say a train or a bus that you get on. It's really no different. But yeah, good point. Yeah, no, well, look, it's a really great kind of illustrative take on what a future, in this case, just I believe 13 years in the future, is going to look like. Although, as we'll see in a moment, the timeline is off by by a few decades, unfortunately. But anyway, his car ends up getting hacked. He crashes into a truck and dies. And this is the point at which, yeah, Poirier will take over and discuss a bit about this issue of safety and cybersecurity generally, and obviously how it relates to AVs. But yeah, let's talk about that sort of timeline, right? So Elon very conveniently crunched some numbers for us a couple years ago. And, well, it turns out there's 2.5 billion conventional gasoline cars in the world. Never mind their level of autonomy, there's 2.5 billion gasoline vehicles in the world. And, well, it turns out that the world's automobile manufacturers can crank out about 100 million vehicles per year. So this offers some pretty cool this offers a lower bound estimate, a theoretical, mathematical lower bound estimate of the total replacement rate of all vehicles, right? And so the idea being that if you could sort of flip a switch and convert all vehicle output to electric overnight, well, it would take about 25 years to produce 100% electric vehicle fleet in the world. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen. Again, this is just a mathematical, theoretical lower bound. But what's neat is, because I know you're also wondering, but Mark, this is electric vehicles, not autonomous vehicles. Well, yeah, except that it is actually, and here's why. So pretty much any electric vehicle today is working on autonomous vehicles and vice versa. Indeed, any car manufacturer not developing the two concurrently today will be dead or dying within 10 years. This is a fact. So anyway, the idea is that you take this then as a really good proxy for the eventual replacement rate of autonomous vehicles. And yeah, again, you get this lower bound of 25 years. Now, again, it's obviously not going to be 25 years. Here's a rather more realistic graph of what it'll look like as it kind of snowballs. And it's a bit convoluted in image, this, but if you study it closely, just color by color, you'll see there's this notion that there's going to be different sorts of avenues to market penetration, whether it's fleet sales, travel industry generally, or sales directly. But yeah, if you kind of extrapolate out, and also you assume a bit of regulatory mandate, as it were, to eventually require autonomous cars, at least in certain areas, certain lanes, certain freeways. Imagine, say, the carpool lanes on the 405. I mean, that seems pretty perfect place. This is a bit more what it would look like. So somewhere in the 2050, 2060 timeframe is when we could start to expect to see these things kind of everywhere. And in this case, by the way, we're talking level 4 and level 5 kind of together. We're not really distinguishing as between the two. And indeed, I'll probably touch on this a bit more later. Just going to mention briefly now, I think really the pursuit of level 5 vehicles is a bit silly and indeed unnecessary. And frankly, it's a lot more challenging, not just technologically, but from a social acceptance, a customer acceptance point of view, right? So if you accept level 4 vehicles as effectively virtual trains, right, in the sense they can only kind of go from point A to point B on certain roads here and there or certain lanes, they really are behaving just like trains. And nobody ever said that trains were bad or that buses with electric overhead propulsion were bad, even though they could only go on certain roads. And so if people sort of accept these as that type of a vehicle, the acceptance rate will go a lot higher. With respect to the timeline, very quickly then, so if you're familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, so I'm going to run through this pretty quickly in the interest of time, but 2014 through 2017, for some reason I can't show you with a pointer on the screen here, but if you look somewhere just below the the threshold of innovation trigger on the left side of each graph, but looking at the 2014 square or quadrant, just before the peak of inflated expectations, you'll see that's where you'll find autonomous vehicles, or rather just after that threshold, I should say. And well, what's happening is that as time has gone on since then, we've kind of gotten more and more enthusiastic about the rate at which AVs are being developed and indeed when they're going to be deployed. But as you continue through the time, you'll see that autonomous vehicles keep kind of slipping further and further until they kind of go past that peak and then they start to fall off the other end until, skip ahead 3 years further, here we are in 2020, and look, autonomous vehicles, level 4, never mind level 5, are now decidedly falling into that so-called trough of disillusionment. In simple terms, if ever there was an example of technology over-promising and under-delivering, this was surely it. Simply put, everybody has been, it's not really fair to say wrong, but rather to say that all the developers of AV tech generally, whether it's the OEM automotive companies, whether it's the hardware, software stack technology startups that are partnering with OEMs, everybody got it all wrong. This stuff is way, I said it's not fair to say that it's wrong. Yeah, it's not that they got it wrong, just people didn't really realize just how big of a deal, how complicated this really is to get right. So yeah, the timeline is indeed slipping. Very quickly, it's very important to mention what an autonomous future means, and rather crucially, what it does not mean. So there's, and here's what I mean by that. So there's really 4 components for an AV future. Obviously, it's got to be autonomous, because of course, the vehicles have to be connected, some form or another, whether it's 5G or whatever. They've got to be connected, both to themselves, to the infrastructure, city infrastructure, so street lights, what have you. They absolutely need to be electric, without even getting to an environmental discussion. As a practical matter, frankly, these are just a lot easier to build too. Not to mention better maintenance. You don't even have to replace brakes on electric cars because of regenerative braking. And they are shared. And this is, in some respects, this is probably the most critically important component that is often not discussed. The notion being that it must be the case that an AV future both moves us away from a private car ownership future, or I should say a private ownership culture, which frankly kind of hurts me too, because I love cars. I'm a hopeless automotive enthusiast, but it must be the case that they're shared. And this then is important too, because of the second reason, which is they must not only be shared, but they must always have occupancy, because we can't keep having roads clogged with these things running all over the place. An analogy is rather like aircraft. You're probably going to hear me make a lot of aircraft analogies throughout this presentation today. Aircraft, as you know, basically, if they're not moving, they're not making money, if they're not full of passengers. Same thing with autonomous cars. Otherwise, autonomous cars are basically going to be the same idea as just continuously adding lanes to a freeway, which, with all due respect to my beloved LA, it doesn't work. Thing is, though, if you do move to an autonomous, shared, electric, connected future, well, this is what happens to the comparative cost of travel. This is dollars per passenger mile. Just going to run through this quickly, but as you can see, we're talking orders of magnitude here, right? So on the left, you've got Lyfts and UberXs. These are pushing $2.50 per passenger mile, but go all the way to the right of the graph, and you end up with, well, the kind of pinnacle of where we're headed, the end game, which is pooled or shared electric autonomous vehicles over 100,000 miles of usage. The resolution of the graph is not sufficient to show you that this is actually about 8, I think, or 10 cents per passenger mile. I mean, it's just staggering the impact this will have. Right, so to close out this section, and before segueing perfectly into Puria's discussion, look, here's the interesting thing, a question I'm asked a lot, is what does autonomous vehicle law really look like? Like, what is it? And, well, here's the thing, for better or worse, AV law is obviously not an entirely new body of law. It's basically 1L year remixed. You've got the same questions, you've got the same problems, and you've got the same-ish solutions. So, for instance, a lot of people have asked me, so what happens if somebody, well, actually, Dira, to the point of the video that you had me watch on Amazon, I mean, it really was, joking aside, it really was perfectly on point. But people say, well, what happens if somebody indeed hacks an autonomous car, and if it does what we saw in that video, crash into the back of a truck intentionally, with the intentional act to kill somebody. Yeah, well, what happens today if someone drives a car through a crowd of pedestrians? You know, what happens if a level 5 truly driverless car crashes? Who's liable? Well, obviously not the driver, because they're not a driver. It gets shifted to the manufacturer, whether it's on the software side of things or on the hardware side of things. So this doesn't need to be overly complicated with respect to what the actual body of law looks like. It's basically just kind of reapplying it to an entirely new field. Speaking of which, and I'm only going to touch on this briefly.
Well, we have one question actually before, Mark, before you
Sure.
go on to the next slide.
Sure.
One question came in the chats is, if you're talking shared, are you therefore excluding short hop trips to the cleaners, drugstore, etc.?
Just to unpack the question, is the question asking, must we presume shared trips for short distance trips as well? Is that the question? Probably.
Ken, is that the question?
So in other words, I think what I'm hearing is, when we talk about a shared future, is this only long distance shared trips or also kind of short distance shared trips? My short answer is yes. I mean, optimally, all of the above, right? In fact, as an aside to this, optimally, parking structures mustn't even have a role either, right? And so, by the way, any parking structures being developed today better allow for sort of a modular design to reduce parking spots, because again, in the future, again, the optimal end game is that no cars without occupants and no parking spots are ever needed, except maybe to briefly charge up, say. But yeah, so short distance, yes, of course, although in that case, just walk. It's healthier too. Which
he thinks that trips that are designated routes will exclude short hops and short trips like that.
Ah, I see. Yeah, it's an interesting question. So not necessarily, right? I mean, so again, just thinking of the optimal end game here, and Pooria and I were discussing this briefly a bit ago too, is that optimally, these will effectively end up behaving just like your own personal train on demand, your personal bus on demand. I mean, if you want to go from your home to the local grocery store, that's not a problem. So that's a vastly improved experience than, well, at least a bus anyway, where you go to a particular bus stop and then you have to walk. Which incidentally raises, it sounds funny to say it, but it does actually raise a health question, which is beyond the scope of this conversation. It's the Wall-E story all over again, where nobody's actually walking or doing any physical activity anymore. So that's another concern, although, I mean, I say it dismissively, but it's actually a thing that people are concerned about, if indeed you have this hyper-optimized point-to-point transport on demand. So let me quickly dive into the trolley paradox. I think that I think perhaps many of you have probably heard about this, but let me just run through it quickly. So it's this admittedly philosophically fascinating thing, which, as you'll see in a moment, I'm not such a fan of in the real world. So the idea is that you've got an autonomous car going down the road, and it's got a choice to either crash into a little kid or grandma, or presumably drive off a bridge and kill the occupants rather than killing any other pedestrians. And the question becomes, how do you program an AV? And again, Dira, with respect to that show, that ridiculous show, there was a one-liner that I missed it. I had to go back and listen again. And indeed, they suggested that the owner, or rather the operator of the autonomous car, should be able to effectively set the priority mode of the car. Like, as an operator, you can say, yeah, I want my car to prioritize either crashing into another vehicle or crashing into a pedestrian, which is a bit morbid.
Well, yeah, and it was also saying that you could set it to save the passengers rather than the pedestrians. Right,
exactly. And I have to say, that was a pretty clever twist on this question, implicitly totally referencing this issue. Here's the thing, though. First of all, I'm a little bit weirded out at the idea of allowing the owner of a vehicle to make that decision preemptively. That seems a bit weird. And frankly, just thinking out loud here, it seems to me that it kind of explicitly contradicts the very essence of the emergency doctrine to begin with. So that's just a very weird thing for me to even wrap my head around. We can discuss this some other time, I suppose. And by the way, anyone who wants, feel free to email or reach out otherwise. But here's the thing. Here's why this example just doesn't make any sense. First of all, it is what engineers would call a corner case or a fringe case, which, look, in general, of course, we've got to handle all these so-called corner cases. I get that. But here's the thing. When was the last time that you, any of you listening, watching this, had to make this sort of a decision? I would guess virtually never, ever. So furthermore, any vehicle, autonomous or human-driven or otherwise, which has already gotten this situation, has already failed. And finally, and rather, I think more crucially, you can't program morality into a machine. It's immoral to do so. And by the way, this image you might see in the credit below there from MIT. So MIT, if you're interested in doing this, they've actually created a game that you can play online. It's called the MIT, the trolley, just Google MIT trolley paradox game or something like that. And the results are fascinating. And just to give you the spoiler alert, it turns out, for instance, here's how culturally dependent this is. US-based or indeed Western-based respondents typically prioritize little kids over elderly. And respondents from most Asian countries tended to prioritize the elderly. So it's a really fascinating thing, but to close the loop on this, all I'm going to say is discuss it until everyone's blue in the face, but put it in a philosophy 101 classroom and throw away the key. I just think it distracts from the bigger issues of AVs, and it ends up being nothing more than a hugely oversized red herring that risks effectively derailing all of this before it even gets underway, and that really scares me. So that is a wrap on part one, so we can open it up some Q&A now. We're going to do Q&A between each of the sections. It made more sense this way.
So I do have one question here. It says, AV for trucking has been tested for decades on the 15 freeways. The view for personal vehicles is to chain a number of them a few feet apart at high speed.
Yeah.
The unanswered question is what happens when, not if or when, but a car has a mechanical failure, leaving fractions of a second of a response time?
That's a good question. It's nice and micro. It's a good low-level question. All right, so look, let's think outside. Just kind of thinking out loud here again. I mean, there's a couple things, right? So first of all, if we go with the idea that it's an electric car, not a conventional mechanical car, just as a matter of mechanical fact, there's a lot less things that can go catastrophically wrong, number one. Number two, the vehicle itself is vastly more intelligent insofar as what's happening and can preemptively take action, or at least arguably it will be able to. And I think third and finally, precisely because of the constraint that you just suggested, that indeed these vehicles are platooning, this necessarily means they are in communication with one another anyway. And so it seems to me pretty likely that the moment at which a mechanical failure occurs, that car will be able to instantly communicate it to other vehicles, and they should be able to adapt accordingly. Look, I don't know how it's going to play out, but that seems to me a rather reasonable thing. And by the way, this is actually one of the only truly strong use cases that I've heard about that truly, I guess, validates the argument, or I guess the what shall I say? It really validates the, I guess, the marketing hype, if you will, of 5G technology. Everyone says, oh, it's going to be faster. You can download movies and music to your phone in a second. That's not what matters about 5G. What matters about 5G is that it's got virtually zero latency. I mean, it's really, really low latency. And again, latency is just, you don't want any sort of delay, any sort of lag. For those of you who grew up or still enjoy the occasional video game, you're familiar with lag where you push a button and nothing happens. Well, it'll kill you in a video game, and it'll certainly kill you in real life. And so that's really one of the most compelling arguments for 5G. So yeah, that's kind of my best answer to that question.
Part two to that question is that he's saying the simple answer is just like a simple example is just like a tire blowout, which affects the steering and braking and et cetera. Like, how would that be handled in AV situation?
Yeah, that is a simpler example. Thanks. Yeah, it's a good call. Look, first of all, before I even try to hypothesize how that would play out, because you're right, it could cause problems, I suppose. I would like to imagine at that point, though, once we're platooning generally, I would like to imagine that the AV tech generally is sufficient to nevertheless safely pull the car over. I know that certain Mercedes already, if I'm not mistaken, will auto brake the car and slow down if there's a tire blowout. But you're right, if they're platooning, they're kind of bumper to bumper like NASCARs on a racetrack. I get it, that is risky. So let me maybe just give a throwaway answer by saying, look, nobody is suggesting for a second that AVs are going to realize, say, Volvo's Vision 2020 mission statement of 0 deaths or injuries. I mean, Volvo have said that they will actually cover all liability. I mean, they will assume full liability for any injuries or accidents or death that occurs in any Volvo vehicle, and that their promise is, 0 injuries, 0 deaths in a Volvo. Look, there will be deaths, there will be injuries. The issue is, can we bring it down by orders of magnitude? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely.
I have a quick question that may kind of seem a little bit funny. Is in that same episode that we were talking about of Upload.
You really like this show, don't you?
No, I did. It wasn't that I liked it. It's just that I really didn't know much about autonomous vehicles, except that I saw these things happening, and I thought, hey, this is a good question. The driver takes control of the vehicle and starts speeding, and he's pulled over, and he blames it on the mechanics and the AI of the car itself. And so, what are the chances that you could get out of a ticket? I mean, to make it funny, but that the driver could actually take over and then misuse the AI.
I mean,
and get out of a ticket.
Yeah, can't you sort of do the same thing today? You could say, "Oh, sorry, officer, my car's cruise control suddenly broke, and it set me to 97 miles per hour on the 405. Actually, that wouldn't even really be speeding on the 405. Anyway, you get my point. I mean, you can use that sort of an argument, I think, anywhere. But I think what's probably going to happen more realistically is, and actually this kind of segues again further into Poria's upcoming discussion in a moment, I don't believe that it's irrational to presume a future where everything is so connected, data and privacy are effectively out the window to a certain extent, when we do have a level 4 and indeed certainly a level 5 future, that, Dira, I don't think that's actually going to even be possible, because all that data will be available to the police officers. And in fact, frankly, police regulation of speeding, that won't even be a thing anymore. I mean, the cars won't actually be able to do that. So I think, and the analogy again is aviation. We give away a lot of rights with aviation. We should expect the same will happen with an autonomous pod car, because let's face it, what's the difference between a tube with wings, which gets you from A to B effectively autonomously, not anonymously, an autonomous pod car on wheels, which similarly gets you from A to B autonomously and decidedly not anonymously. So I think it's going to be avoided altogether.
Well, as I was watching the show and I had looked over your slides, I was thinking, how is that even possible when the police will have that information before?
Right. That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. I mean, you can't evade this sort of a thing.
So are there any other questions?
I think we have an open question from Ms. Maravalli.
If we have to make a decision about who lives and dies, then we are right back to today. Where's the progress?
So wait, that's an interesting question. So where's the progress? Meaning, all right, so kind of presupposing that the act of making that decision is not progress, I guess. So this reminds me of a law firm that invited me to do a podcast with them on actually this notion of the so-called reasonably prudent AI standard. And the idea that we all kind of collectively came up with, it was 2 other attorneys and me, was this notion that if indeed we end up at a future of autonomous general intelligence, as it's called, then the vehicle should be able to make a rational decision without any engineers having proactively manufactured that sense of ethics, but rather the vehicle should do it. And then eventually we should be at a point where there is indeed that concept of the reasonable AI, meaning in those similar scenarios, what would other AI vehicles have done? Basically, it's applying the emergency doctrine to a car, to a machine, to a computer. So I think it's not, this is actually a big reason why I think, again, you can't program ethics in, that's just not going to fly. I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever to let an operator preemptively decide. That's outrageous to me. So I think it's going to have to rely on the evolution of the AI itself and to effectively flesh out standards and, apply the emergency doctrine to AI. I know it sounds just ridiculous, but that's where things are going.
So one of the other attendees just made a comment and said that this hypo is regarding the decision who to kill is the trolley car conundrum. And for a good discussion in a novel, see Xeroglyph by Vince Pravat. So Sharon, if you're interested in that, there's a novel about how to make these decisions.
Wait, this is a
Thank
novel
you.
for a second? I thought you were quoting a case on something or other, but yeah, okay.
No, it's
cool.
a novel. So thank you, Ken. And Sharon, please feel free to refer to the novel for your information.
Probably not a primary source of, yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for the questions.
There's one last question is, what are the stock market plays on AV at present?
Oh, gosh. Okay. Way to put me on the spot. Well,
Sorry,
this is, so I guess if ever there was a moment for full disclosure, I've been a very, very, very long Tesla holder, like since 2012. So you can extrapolate my views there. Look, here's the thing. Well, to the point that I made earlier, remember, any company must be concurrently developing AV and EV. And so if they don't have that on their roadmap, then probably a pretty bad play to consider. Also, recognize something really important. Technology companies in the AV space are effectively little startups, generally Silicon Valley or Detroit area or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania startups. They're not automakers. So what they're doing is they're partnering with automakers, and everyone's kind of pairing off like at a high school dance because the big automotive companies are realizing they don't have the technological know-how to build these things. And the small technology companies, excluding Tesla, which is obviously not small anymore, they've realized they can't build cars. Tesla has demonstrated it's a very, very difficult thing to build cars. The only other potential competitor one day I can think of is Rivian, which if you don't know them, check them out. Really, really cool. They're the company into which Amazon invested. So I guess my short answer is look to the technology companies, especially those that are partnering or at least working with other automotive companies. Some good examples that come to mind. I mean, this is after the fact, of course, but just to give examples, GM partnered up with, or rather acquired effectively, Cruise in San Francisco, along with Honda. Recently, Aptiv with Hyundai. Voyage, Fiat Chrysler with Voyage, I guess. So everyone's kind of consolidating because, again, at the point of that timeline, people are realizing this is vastly more complex, and everyone's got to work together.
All right. Is there anybody else? Someone else is commenting that they're not experts on autonomous vehicles, but Intel is heavily invested in AI for autonomous vehicles through its acquisition of Mobileye.
And most recently, Move It.
So I don't see any more questions in the feed. So with that, Poria, is it time for your portion to start now?
Yeah, happy to move into part two. Mark, when you stop sharing your screen,
I'm trying to. I can't see my mouse pointer, so I've got to guess where the stop share button. Sorry, guys. Nope. Yeah. Nope. Sorry, everybody. The mouse pointer disappears, and so I literally cannot stop. Thank you, whoever did that.
Okay.
You're welcome.
I will go ahead and mute on my end for now.
So hi, everyone. My name is Poria Paknejad. There are a broad array of issues AV raises legally. I'm going to focus today specifically on the intersection of privacy, cybersecurity, and autonomous vehicles. And I want to start with this quote by the Godfather from a time before when he was the Godfather. And the point is that this is relevant to autonomous vehicles because cybersecurity in the context of AVs is about your privacy, your passenger's privacy, in many regards, your client's privacy. You're in fact trading in your right to privacy in services that we're going to discuss in the upcoming slides in exchange for the vehicle's autonomy. It's autonomous by virtue of the data it is so persistently collecting. So let's take a look at the categories of data that are collected by autonomous vehicle. This isn't comprehensive by any means, but they can generally be broken up into two categories. One is driver data and the other is location data. So let's focus first on driver data. It'll look at things like what contacts are stored on your phone if it's connected with Apple Play, Android, or even Bluetooth. Are you or your passengers in the habit of wearing a safety belt? Not just in the moment, but it'll keep a log of how often those belts are worn and under what conditions. Are you a lead foot? What's your average braking force in G's, your acceleration force, radio genres? How often do you charge your car's batteries? As to location data, it'll look at where you usually charge your car, how often you charge it, where do you shop, work, play, or eat, what routes do you typically take to these places, what stores are along the route, is there construction on a given day, what's the traffic like? And it aggregates this data. And there's a lot of value to this data, and you're giving that value up by virtue of driving where you're going and just living life. And this creates the issue of who owns the data. In this case, not you. Not you, not your passengers, certainly not your clients. We're going to take a look at one example here, which is Tesla, because it's just so ubiquitous in terms of data is handled. If you look in the agreement, the purchase and sale agreement of a typical Tesla, and you really down and buried in paragraph 36, you'll see that they have a privacy policy that points you to some janky URL where their privacy policy exists. Can they change that at whim? Yeah, they can. Is the privacy policy that's currently there necessarily the policy that was in place when you signed your agreement with Tesla? Maybe, but the point is it can be changed. But let's take a look at what it looks like today. And I don't mean to pick on Tesla. We're just using them as an example because everybody is familiar with their products. The privacy policy for Tesla currently reads that they'll retain the information they collect from or about you regarding their products or services for a period necessary as required by law. Now, who wants to get their hands on this kind of data? These are literal hands. I'm talking about metaphorical hands. Advertisers would love to get a hold of this data. App developers, insurance carriers, companies dealing in roadside assistance. And the reason they want to is because there's value in the aggregation of the data that can give them information on what the road conditions are like, where you do like to shop. Advertisers in particular will micro-target you, depending on your shopping and travel habits. And when we went through this originally with Mark asked me, who really cares about privacy? Is that really an issue? And I thought that was a great question. I think it's taken, for me at least, it's taken as axiomatic that people want their privacy. But when we drilled down into it, we saw that plenty of people in the world happily trade in their privacy in exchange for likes or hearts in the retweets and with Twitter and hearts on Instagram. And so I took a look at this, and the most recent credible poll I could find was in 2015. I don't think views on privacy have changed too much since then. And it was done by Pew Research. And in that poll, 90% of Americans said it's either very important or somewhat important that they have control over the data that companies collect from them. And Mark's company, Hogan Co., did a wonderful poll as well. The results of the poll on this issue and the results of the poll show that roughly 60%, give or take, in some form or fashion agree that data privacy is a factor to consider in purchasing an autonomous vehicle. A full 60% of participants or respondents said that data security is a concern that would stop them from buying an autonomous vehicle, depending on which way this issue ends up going. And I know, Mark, you had something to add on this slide as well.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, just to be clear, this is actually a survey that we're conducting. Where'd my video go? Yeah, so this is actually a survey we've been conducting kind of around the world for a few months. Just a quick comment though, with respect to data, Tesla Insurance is live in California, and Tesla Insurance effectively modulates your insurance premiums in real time, dynamically, based on how you drive, based on the data collected. Here Technologies, owned by Daimler, they collect sensor data from vehicles, everything down to suspension data, which they can then effectively sell back to city municipalities to let cities know where they need to work on roads. this is a really big deal because, well, it's a lot cheaper than just kind of randomly driving about, surveying everywhere.
Right. So here's the thing. We know that AVs are coming. We see their proliferation, and they appear to be as convenient in daily life as cell phones are. And the use of cell phones has obviously exploded around the world. The use of AVs is probably going to continue to go up as well. But they need data in order to keep getting better. And the use of that data and the control over that data has created a burning problem that needs a solution. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. We don't want to get rid of AVs. We want to be able to make sure that the problems that we're discussing with regard to privacy are properly legislated or regulated so that they can continue development that in harmony with society. So what's the solution? Well, it turns out that the solution is actually found in the text of the same privacy statement that we read from Tesla earlier. And specifically, if you drill down, it says unless a longer period is required or permitted by law. By law is the operative clause there. We can create the laws, we can create the regulations to make sure that the companies are following in step with what society is demanding from their privacy. This is democracy, in my opinion, pretty good solution. So let's talk about the existing laws governing autonomous vehicles, and in the final module, Mark will discuss proposed future laws. Right now, I want to focus just on the existing laws governing autonomous vehicles and privacy specifically. These can be broken up broadly into two categories. The first category is laws regulating the operation of autonomous vehicles. These are laws that address the existence of these vehicles on public roadways. And next, we'll talk about laws regulating the data that's inherent, the data collection that's inherent in the function of AVs. Remember, no data, no AVs. So let's focus first on the laws that deal with the existence of these vehicles on the road. We have about 75% of states now, I think it's 36 states, that have passed a law or regulation addressing autonomous vehicles on their public roadways. The autonomous can be broken up into two, or the laws regarding these autonomous vehicles can be broken up into two types. One is a somewhat driverless category. There's 66 companies that fall into that category, and there's the true driverless categories like Waymo or Nuro. Nuro operates these little autonomous robots that deliver groceries and stuff of that nature at lower speeds than vehicles. But yeah, states are already on top of this as it relates to their existence on their roadways. However, fewer states have addressed the issue of the data that's being collected by the AVs that's inherent in their function. Unsurprisingly, our state, California, has taken heed on addressing cybersecurity issues in that sphere. They've done this in two ways. There are other salient laws, but I want to focus on the two that are the most salient to the issues we're discussing today. The first one is 13 CCR 228.24, and the second one is the CCPA. Let's talk first about 13 CCR 228.4. You'll see this falls under a section of the Code of Regulations that's specifically designated for autonomous. Yes, we have that in California. Yes, it's good, and yes, it's a good thing that the legislature has already looked forward to carving out a space in the CCR these types of vehicles. And 13 CCR 228.24 just says that if you're a company that collects data from the drivers, passengers, or otherwise of vehicles that operate autonomously, you are required to anonymize that data. So in the example that I gave earlier, if data is given to advertisers or to any third parties, they can't be tied directly to you. Micro-targeting is going to be a hell of a lot harder for the advertisers because of 13 CCR 228.24, and the value of that data may drop. I don't know what the practical impact is this going to be, aside from protection of consumers, which is a good thing. So that's 13 CCR 228.24. Let's talk now the CCPA. We could probably do a whole hour and a half on just the CCPA. I'm sure if you look around, you'll find MCLEs as well. I just want to talk very high level about the CCPA as it relates to autonomous vehicles. To my mind, it's an excellent law. It is the type of law that's typically passed by federal governments, entire nations. A close analog to it would be GDPR in Europe. And it's a good forward-facing consumer-friendly law that says in California, If a company is collecting data from you, you, the consumer, are entitled to access, a right to delete the data that they collect from you, opting out of the sale of third parties, and non-discriminating in the way that data is collected. As it relates to AVs, all those things we discussed about how you've used the car's connectivity, done anything can be traced back to you. These would all fall under the CCPA with some options, as I have that disclaimer at the bottom. There's also a provision in there about biometric data collected from passengers. Mark, what's the company that's collecting biometric data from its passengers?
Well, the one that comes to mind specifically is a company in Boston, I believe, called Affectiva. And just to be super clear, this isn't simply a question of whether or when, or rather, I should say whether, if companies are going to be collecting bio data, but rather it's already happening. And the idea in this case is Affectiva effectively tracks pretty much all the biometric stuff they can, physiological or otherwise. They even do facial analysis to understand how are the occupants of the vehicle behaving, how are they, are they comfortable in the car, that sort of thing. So this is a foregone conclusion. So the question becomes, how much do you want to give up? Or alternatively, if you didn't give it up, can you even use the thing at all? Or at least, can you use it well?
Right. So, so the CCPA would protect against the collection of that data as well. So that's the CCPA very, very broadly. I'm not doing it much justice, but just justice for the purpose of discussion here today. The AG is supposed to begin enforcement on July 1. That may or may not be affected by the existence of COVID. The CCPA also grants a private right of action, although it modifies it of what personal is for private rights of action. The first one was already filed in February against, I believe, Hannah and Salesforce. I expect there will be many more to come. As it relates to AVs, though, we'll find out. The next part we'll talk about proposed laws, and I'm happy to take any questions anyone has.
We have a couple questions here, Poria, for you. One of them is, isn't the problem with these laws the exception that Tesla uses, quote, or not prohibited, unquote? Tesla and other companies have the most influence over those laws, which can give them a big loophole. What do you think about that?
Yes. If the broader question's about lobbying, I hate it. I don't want for the parties in interest to have any influence over the legislation that's going to directly impact their core business. It needs to be consumer facing. It needs to be something that addresses the constituents first and foremost, not the folks that are subject to these regulations themselves. So I agree with you. However, my point isn't that the existing laws are going to fully comprehensively cover those issues, but that we can legislate around it so that they are forced to follow the regulations as are best suited for consumer purposes. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I think so. We'll see. We have another comment on privacy, noting that the difference between the poll results and people's actions, that they didn't think anyone read the Zoom agreement before allowing the seminar to be okayed on their computers. So do you think that people will just skip over those privacy issues and just sign on so they could use these Tesla and different AV?
Yeah, I mean, boilerplate licensing agreements generally for software are something people gloss over, but the reality is you have a choice not to use the software. Particular presentation, my understanding is it's going to be published publicly afterwards. So any concerns about privacy wouldn't really apply unless it's a lower level privacy as to user data, at which point, yeah, there is some faith placed in the companies that we're using, but in exchange, they're giving us a fairly valuable service in being able to information of the public.
Hey, just a friendly reminder, there is, of course, a South Park episode on precisely this issue.
Great show. One of the greatest shows.
We should talk a lot more about TV. There's one more question here. Several studies have shown that it's possible to reverse engineer annotated data and track back to its source. The key question should be, what data is absolutely necessary to develop the technology to a safe level, and what data is merely convenient for advertisers to sell more products and services?
I agree. I can't see right now the question, but I agree wholeheartedly. the point, if I understand the distilled point they're making here is from an ancillary or tertiary perspective, you could collect tons of data because you could put as many sensors as are in existence in humanity on these cars to collect information about an array of things that aren't relevant to the development of the vehicle or its AI or its AV future. That's just stuff that they collect because they can sell it and monetize it. And I agree wholeheartedly with that point. At a minimum, share it back with the people who are generating the data. This may be an unpopular opinion, but I think the people who are generating data are entitled to a portion of the revenue, because absent the folks who are driving these vehicles around and generating data that has so much value, they wouldn't proliferate this technology.
Just a couple of quick comments on that, if I may. Just a friendly reminder that Tesla is always collecting this kind of data under the so-called, what is it called actually? Shadow driving method they use to collect data. Basically what that means is even if you're not using Tesla's autopilot system, it's still learning from everything you're doing, constantly, all the time. I mean, let me just make that clear. Even when you're not using autopilot, you effectively are using it from the car's ability to learn and to share that data with its AI net, from which it then educates other vehicles. So again, it's kind of a foregone conclusion that if you want to use this technology, it must be the case you're sharing this data. And to the point of anonymizing data, from a purely technical point of view, I mean, if everything used 256-bit bank level encryption end to end, I mean, at least theoretically, that should be pretty secure. Or sorry, one other thing. You could also imagine that cars end up just becoming a rolling VPN. That's another solution.
So that concludes my portion. I'll hand it off to Mark now for part 3.
All right, let me fire this up again. Nope, sorry. Share screen, and we're back. Well, somehow we ended up, sorry everyone, got to fly through to the next section. Give me a second, please.
Yeah, we're a few minutes, we'll go a few minutes over, so we appreciate you staying on if you can.
Sure, I will fly through this pretty quick, especially since it's largely theoretical. The idea is this. I want to talk about fava, not the beans, but rather a thing that I've been kind of thinking a lot about, the need for a so-called Federal Autonomous Vehicle Administration. So obviously stateside, we've got the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. Internationally, we've got the ICAO, the UN's International Civil Aviation Organization, and the IATA, the International Air Transport Association. All three of which are directly responsible for having taken air travel from the admittedly rather dangerous thing it used to be once upon a time, and turning it into, I was about to say, the safest mode of transit in the world. Really, airplanes are more than that, aren't they? Being in a commercial jetliner at cruising altitude is actually the safest place you can be on the globe, which is a pretty mind-blowing stat to think about. Anyway, so with respect to this survey that we've been conducting for a few months now, the question one of the questions we've put out there is, should a national agency regulate self-driving cars? Perhaps not so surprisingly, you can see how the data is skewing towards an older age group. But regardless, you then look at the results of this part of the survey, which asked respondents from all over the world, do you think your infrastructure is ready for AVs? And well, you can see what that looks like. Generally speaking, no, not really. And indeed, that is, of course, correct. And I think crucially, do people believe that we eventually need to have dedicated AV-only lanes? Yeah, probably a pretty good idea. And you kind of think about this, and you put it all together. And so this concern that I have is that if we don't get a federal framework up and running sooner rather than later, we potentially end up shooting ourselves in the foot when things inevitably go wrong. Now, here's what I mean by that. Just to be super clear, I'm really, really happy that things are effectively in states' hands now insofar as development, testing, and even deployment. As Poria touched on earlier, California, for instance, 66 companies are allowed to test autonomous cars now with a backup driver. 2 companies are allowed to test with no driver whatsoever, namely Waymo and Neuro, which is testing an affectionately named R2, of course, delivery droid. It can operate on roads 35 miles per hour or less. Here's the problem. We don't have this sort of framework. Now, yes, the federal government has tried proposing it's called a set of guidelines called AV START. They're now on version 4.0, hasn't been fully adopted yet. And anyway, this is the problem we're looking at, right? We don't have any concept of standards. We didn't touch too much on the technologies, but suffice to say, the one you've probably heard most about is the question whether to have LiDAR for autonomous vehicle perception of the world or computer vision. Quick crash course, LiDAR is the apparatus which emits laser all around the car, and the reflected bounced laser light creates a 3D point cloud of the world around the car. This is how the vehicle can see an actual three-dimensional representation of the world. Every single autonomous car manufacturer, every single one, uses LiDAR, except Tesla. Because, of course, Elon's argument is that eventually the rate at which AI-powered computer vision is advancing will render LiDAR effectively obsolete. After all, as he says, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but correctly, humans don't have LiDAR. We can see the world just fine. So anyway, you consider this notion that we need a set of standards, both with respect to design, with respect to even urban design, which, mind you, is going to change quite a bit. As I think we may have mentioned briefly, even parking structure design is going to need to change, be modular, to adapt. Obviously, Puriya talked a lot about security and privacy issues, and I am kind of flying through these quickly in the interest of time. Happy to answer any questions. And of course, the issue of traffic and therefore, well, taxes, obviously. I mean, I hate to say it, but what better way to help incentivize the maximizing occupancy in a car than effectively really building upon how carpools operate, right? So the fewer occupants in a car, the more it's going to cost, the less occupants, the more it's going to cost, obviously. With respect to standards, a good example, another good analogy, again, looking at aviation, when Airbus deployed fly-by-wire technology, which used a computer interface rather than physical connections between the pilot and the control surfaces of the plane, well, nobody knew if it was good enough. Well, they decided the standard should be what Boeing uses, mechanical flight linkages. If Airbus could demonstrably prove that fly-by-wire was sufficient, then it was good enough. Well, we don't even have those sorts of questions answered now with respect to LiDAR versus computer vision. Arguably, Tesla are doing pretty well without LiDAR. So anyway, these are some of the things that I really think desperately need to be resolved sooner rather than later, because again, if we don't have a suitable framework for this, and no, I don't think that NHTSA is sufficient, this needs to be ready to go. And so to wrap this up, to close the loop on this quickly, I think that as long as vehicle development is level 1, 2, or 3 on that spectrum of autonomous vehicle stage, then that's fine. It can remain in states' hands. But as soon as you want to test and deploy level 4, level 5 cars on roads, this has to become a federal thing. And my proof for this is simply this. You've got things crossing state lines. If nothing else, this is by definition a federal thing now. So, that's the logic for airplanes, and it must certainly be the same for boxes on wheels.
So one question came up is, why is the Transportation Administration not capable of incorporating the AV? Why is FABA needed?
Yeah, so I spent a month in DC last year to try and figure this out for myself. I guess the best way to answer the question is, I don't know. And neither do they, frankly. There's a lot of disconnect, and there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape, obviously, and there's a massive gap. I'm not going to give names, but I spoke to somebody rather prominent at NHTSA, for instance, who said that there is indeed a huge disconnect as between technology on one hand and law and policy on the other. And I guess my argument would be this. In the same way that the FAA falls under the DOT generally, which, okay, that's fine. That's a great little umbrella under which these things can fall. In the same way, you will decidedly need a dedicated administration just for AVs, because again, if nothing else, they are so immensely complex to even put them under the same umbrella as some sort of administration responsible for cars and trucks and trains generally doesn't make any sense. In fact, I think it's, just thinking out loud again, I think it's really a disservice to consumers, to people everywhere, to even call these things cars. They're not. They are effectively, as I've said, airplanes without wings, and they need their own administration just for all the unimaginable complexities that come with them. This is probably the greatest technological challenge that humanity has embarked on since going to the moon. No doubt.
Well, I have one more question, which is a comment, and it says that from June, this has been an extremely interesting webinar with great content. I do have a question. I am a driver lesser of a BMW electric vehicle. Is BMW collecting data on my driving and shopping habits? If yes, I do not recall reading or signing any consent documents regarding this when I signed the lease. Do you have any comments on that, gentlemen?
I have a comment which is rather more tongue-in-cheek, but Puriya, I'll probably defer to you first on this.
So I'm unfamiliar with BMW's data retention practices, or even the technology underlying the EVs or any AV that they have in their vehicles generally. I can tell you this, and it's anecdotal, so take it at face value. I have a Tesla, among other cars. I didn't know that the privacy that I showed today in the webinar existed until I got into the motor vehicle agreement and saw paragraph 36 in preparation for this webinar. And I thought to myself, I don't recall signing anything. I don't recall signing any specific disclosures on the use of data or of data, but it has to be there. It must be there. And sure enough, it was there in paragraph 36, even though it referred you out to some of their URL that Tesla maintains their privacy policy on. It's possible that it's buried somewhere in the lease documents in the event that BMW is collecting that data. I would recommend looking through it again. If not, I don't want to speculate any further in a public forum, but we can chat about it offline as to what that means for you and for BMW.
Yeah, I'll just add by saying, honestly, if it's a newish model, you said it's one of their electric hybrids, so I'm guessing a 530e or something like that. I mean, honestly, it probably is collecting quite a bit of data, because I know, again, with reference back to HERE Technologies, which again is Daimler owned, but they're in partnership with and collecting data from many other vehicles, not just Mercedes vehicles. And if I'm not mistaken, BMW is one of them. And yeah, some of that data they collect with at least certain of their vehicles, suspension data, windshield wiper data. It's pretty cool though when you think about it, right? Because by accumulating this kind of data, say suspension data, or wheel slip data to let other cars know, for instance, where there is ice on the road. This isn't actually deployed yet, but this is the eventual use case. So it's potentially really useful stuff for all of us operating a vehicle generally. I mean, I'd like to believe that unless this data is used in a bad way, I mean, the truth is we are benefiting from it, generally speaking. I mean, I don't mean to be flippant about this, but when was the last time any of us read all the terms with respect to using Google or anything else for that matter? I mean, okay, maybe some of us are. But the point is we are in a data-centric world, and to Puriya's point earlier, virtually every single piece of technology that we use simply cannot function but for the data that we share with it.
Well, this has been really interesting. Are there any other questions? I don't see any waiting. Alex, do you see anything?
Nope, none so far.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
With that, I want to thank everybody for staying on this extra few minutes. This has been a really interesting webinar and a process for me. I've learned a lot from you guys. I want to thank both of you, Mark and Puriya, for entertaining us and educating us with this. And it's been great working with you. I hope we can do more webinars together. You guys are wonderful to work with, and I really appreciate your time and effort spent on this.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you all for joining us. Yeah, it's been a blast.